Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today we're going back to 1863 and the Battle of Chancellorsville. While I was researching the story of Asa Holbrook, who is pictured here, he's a sergeant in the 14th Brooklyn, although you might be fooled when you notice his chevrons. Picture him as a corporal. It's actually how he started out. He becomes a sergeant by the time of Chancellorsville. As I was researching his story, I thought about what would happen to your family. What would your family do when they discovered that you were wounded in battle? Well, in Asa's case, his father, Jonathan, headed down from their home in Brooklyn, New York, to try to find his son. So it's an interesting story. And I found a letter that he wrote that details what he found and how he found his son. Before I get there, let me tell you a little bit more about Asa. So he is a clerk working in New York City, and just a couple of days after the bombardment of Fort Sumter, in fact, on April 14th, 1861, he enlists and he joins Company F of the 14th Brooklyn. Goes on to go to Washington and then participates in all of the early battles, including First Bull Run, where the regiment earns the nom de guerre red-legged devils for the Chaucer-inspired uniforms that they adopted. And you can see the uniform here with the very tight three columns of buttons all closely knit together. You got the blue uniform, the red chevrons, fancy uniform for sure. So Holbrook goes on to fight in the battles of the Peninsula Campaign, Second Bull Run, and Antietam, survives all of this unscathed. But during the Battle of Chancellorsville on April 29th, they get orders, the regiment receives orders to assist engineers in launching pontoon boats across the Rappahannock River in the face of a punishing enemy fire. Now, the regimental history says this. Instantly, the 14th responded. After stacking arms, the right wing of the regiment manned the trucks bearing the boats, and at a given signal, with a wild yell of defiance, the men rushed them toward the riverbank. It was something like running an engine to a fire in old Brooklyn. At first, then vastly different. Once in the fire zone, the volleys of the enemy staggered, almost checked the intrepid advance. The regimental historian continues, but only for a moment did the troopers hesitate, with men falling right and left, bullets spattering and flattening on the trucks and singing like swarms of angry bees about their ears. They gathered strength, pressed onward, and, in the time taken in telling, reached the river and launched the boats. So, mission accomplished. But there was a lot of casualties taken. And two Iron Brigade regiments, the 6th Wisconsin and 24th Michigan, sprint from their position under cover to the boats, jump in the boats, and then they start pulling those oars to go to the opposite shore. So the 14th Brooklyn has done its job getting those boats ready. And as I mentioned, a number of casualties, including Holbrook. He's wounded at some point in all of this, and he is taken along with other Redlegs to the Chatham Manor across the Rappahannock from Fredericksburg. It's a grand estate. It's now been converted to a hospital, and the building itself has suffered serious damage from the new occupants. Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, word gets to Asa's father, Jonathan, that his son has been wounded. And what does Jonathan do? Says, I'm going to find my boy. And he does just that. And he searches heads out to Virginia, and he writes what he finds in a letter, and he sends a letter to his local newspaper in Brooklyn, the Times-Union, and the letter is dated May 18th, 1863, and it's published just a day later in the May 19th edition. So Jonathan Holbrook wrote this letter specifically to the newspaper to update them on what happened to some of the men who are in the 14th Brooklyn, what happened to them in the recent action. Because news at the time is being largely reported in a bunch of different ways, including letters from eyewitnesses. And so Jonathan, the father, his letter is news. It's almost breaking news. It's written 2 weeks after the action takes place. Word is still trickling in. Anxious parents want to know about their sons. Families want to know what's going on. And folks in Brooklyn who may not be connected with the regiment, they want to know what's going on with their hometown 14th. So Jonathan tells them of his adventures, and the story appears under the headline, Special from Hooker's Army. Of course, this is Joe Hooker, Fighting Joe, Special from Hooker's Army, the 14th Brooklyn. And so here's Jonathan in his own words describing what happened and who was injured and where he found them. One more detail. You're going to find here that he finds the men grouped in 3 different places. So here we go. Having just returned from the Army of the Potomac and vicinity, where I have been in search of my son, who was wounded at the battle near Fredericksburg, Virginia, I thought it might be of some interest to your numerous readers and many friends of the 14th Regiment in Brooklyn to hear from them. In looking after my son, I visited some 15 or more hospitals in Washington, D.C., and as many more between Aquia Creek and Falmouth Station. During my visits to those hospitals, I saw all of those named below, either sick or wounded, of the 14th Regiment, nearly all of whom were convalescent. I was 5 days with the 14th boys and found them mostly in first-rate spirits, expecting and ready to have another brush with Johnny Secesh. They are hoping to be sent home soon to recruit and fill up their ranks. Their number now, I am informed, is about 400 men fit for duty. So that's Jonathan's basic update. Now, to help assuage the concerns of parents who might be reading, he's able to give an update and in one case, some bad news to the families. So here are the details, which I think you might find interesting. By the way, as I'm reading, look for Asa's name. He's not mentioned first, but you'll hear it when it comes. So here's Jonathan's list. In hospital at Aquia Creek, Virginia, Matthew Hathor, T. Wagner, W. Ryan, H. Walcott, P. Matthews. In Columbus Hospital, Washington, sick and wounded, J. O'Connor, J. Hotimer, J. Collimer, William Goldsmith, E. Stevens, M. Murphy, A. Posson, J. Sands, W. Davis, J. H. Geiselman, Chambers, Matthews, Norton. At Fitzhugh House, 4 miles below Falmouth, wounded in the late battles at Fredericksburg, John Benet, wounded in left side, doing well. A. Smock, both legs, one amputated, the other a ball through the flesh above the knee, doing well. Lieutenant Bloomfield, wounded in breast, ball still in right lung, very bad. Asa A. Holbrook, there's his boy, wounded in shoulder, ball is out at the elbow, fractured bone badly, will probably save the arm. P. Murphy, wounded in the head, died, buried on Saturday. T.W. Artis, leg amputated, doing well. P. Van Ingen, shoulder, doing well. Yours, J.D. Holbrook. So there's that letter from Jonathan. He really is writing to help everyone who understands the 14th, who cares about the 14th, the families of the 14th, to understand what's going on and to share his adventures. So imagine you're a father and you're traveling from Brooklyn, New York, all the way down to Washington, going through 15, at least he says, 15 different hospitals scattered throughout the city, probably walking into each one and saying, I'm looking for men from the 14th Brooklyn who were recently wounded. Can you help me? He's talking to nurses. He's talking to doctors, anyone with whom he can make contact to find out what's going on. He finally finds 3 groupings, and it is from Washington all the way down to Falmouth. Imagine going through these hospitals and finding all the individuals, and then that moment of reunion, which he doesn't detail here. He doesn't get that personal, but he does. Imagine that moment after going through all of that, the 15 hospitals in DC, and then coming down further south, that moment of reunion to see his son with a badly wounded arm, probably talking to the doctor and the nurse in the ward to get a sense of what's going on, to understand the prognosis. Remember, he says he spent 5 days there. So I suspect that during that time, he was doing his best to get supplies and help these guys as much as he could to alleviate any of their sufferings. So a really interesting letter, I think. And also the fact that he was mindful enough to put it into the newspaper, at least submit it to the editors, is, I think, speaks to his compassion as a father, a compassion as a citizen of Brooklyn, and his compassion and love for the soldiers in the service. So 2 more notes. Jonathan, the father, he goes on to live. He survives the war and lives until 1874. And Asa, he survives that arm wound. There is no amputation. He keeps both of his arms, goes on to serve through the rest of his enlistment, lives a long life, moving to Los Angeles. He settles in California and dies there in 1915. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode.